Good morning to everyone. Good morning, Costa. My talk is named The Eastern Orthodox Singing and its Epistemological Approach, Possibilities and Limits. The Modern Science Understanding. This is the first chapter. Before accepting a particular field of reflective thinking as able to be an autonomous science, it is needful the meaning of science to be first clarified. Initially, what is science is a philosophical question, moreover metaphysical, and one can see various answers given by philosophers through the ages. One of the most detailed and in the same time short one belongs to Martin Heidegger. In his paper Science and Reflection, Heidegger gives the remarkable definition: science is the theory of the real. It requires we must understand what we are going to say using the words theory and real. So in the following pages he describes the radical differences between the ancient medieval and modern age understanding of them. Heidegger describes that we cannot replace the basic character and characteristics of modern real. Quotation. The real, he says, is what presences as self-exhibiting, but what presences shows itself in the modern age in such a way as to bring its presencing to a stand in objectness. Science corresponds to this holding sway of presencing in terms of objects as theory of the real, challenges forth the real specifically through aiming its objectness. Science sets upon the real. It orders it into place to the end that at any given time the real will exhibit itself as an interacting network. It is inserviable series of reflected causes. The real thus becomes serviable and capable of being followed out in its sequences. The real becomes secured in its objectness. For this, there result spheres of areas of objects that scientific observation can entrap after its fashion. Entrapping representation which secures everything in that objectness, which is thus capable of being followed out, is the fundamental characteristic of the representing through which modern science corresponds to the real. End of the quotation. This passage gives us a precise icon of how is based the actuality of modern science, how this science works in order to prove its inner desire to be the most important font of truth in terms of certainty, or at least of the access to the certainty. The certainty is guaranteed by the authority of the modern scientific method of observation, which is, on the other hand, based initially on the new subject-object observation pointed out by Descartes. Cogito sum is not just the newest method for justifying my existence and the dependence of starting point of my personality from cogito, but it is constitutive for any scientific true belief. In our case, cogito sum is equal to cogito ergo certum mihi est. In thinking is my certainty, reliability. Thereafter, the reality of any certain est, existence, is accessible for the man only on the base of the reflective thinking. The thinking which thinks its own action, it est, has self-consciousness. The certainty, namely, of that consciousness is the fundament of the new European science. Proofs and evidences as part of the science are now warrantable only and if they are results of cogitative observations. The title of Descartes' treatise alone is sufficiently illustrative for his aims. Discours de la méthode pour bien conduire ses raisons et chercher la vérité dans les sciences. Discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in the field of science. Allow me to put here the first of his famous étals, or rules. The first rule was never to accept anything as true unless I recognize it to be evidently such, that is, carefully to avoid precipitation and prejudgment, and to include nothing in my conclusions unless it presented itself so clearly and distinctly to my mind. Literally, it said in French, à mon esprit, which translated into English, to my mind, that there was no occasion to doubt it. Taking just these Heidegger's and Descartes' words together, one can easily conclude that the main question of which of the general or particular human activity can be accepted as a science and respectively as autonomous science has its answer in simply this way. The science is whether present or absent. Present is in observing the phenomena we first meet with as perceptions and impression, according to the law of cogitation and thus of objectiveness. To constitute an autonomous science requires existence of a law, nomos, which comes from other than cogitative and analytical source. However, Descartes proved that there is only one autonomy which is able to found science, the autonomy of cogito, or cogito. According to this, it is a contradiction to speak about an autonomous sciences. Yes, we do speak about sciences in plural, but the same Descartes does as well. Quotation. Among the branches of philosophy I had, when younger studied logic, and among those of mathematics, geometrical analysis, and algebra, 3 arts of science, and the quotation continues. Here, Descartes equalizes art to science and the opposite, explaining a bit later that, quotation, all these particular sciences which we commonly call mathematics, for I saw that although the objects they discuss are different, all of them are in agreement in limiting their consideration to the relationships of proportions between their various objects. End of the quotation. What puts together different arts or sciences is the common for all objects proportions, which the science figures out and analyzes. Using plural sciences, we are simply speaking about different branches on the same tree of science. Science as music and musicology. The historical relationships between music and mathematics are quite well known. Quotation. Because it relies on precise measurement, music was considered until fairly modern times, indeed until the middle of 17th century, a branch of science. It is Claude Paliska. And in the late antiquity was part of the quadrivium. Thus, the mentioned equalization of arts as sciences could be a historical continuation of this mathematical understanding of music. And yet, the main change which takes constitutive position with the modern age is the possibility measuring calculation in terms of Western developed punctual thinking to be taken as the most important assistant for the basic theoretical goal of the new European musicology. Namely, through maximum precise notation system to make accessible and reasonable the existing live and thinkable musical phenomenon, and thus to be able to preserve even oral traditions which are entirely vocal. One can admire the theoretical, for instance, success of Prince Dmitri Kandemir. About 50 years after Descartes' death, he invented a new theoretical system of notation through which he succeeded to notate in an accurate and analytical way entire compositions of Ottoman classical music. The idea came to him after reflections on, quotation, the pragmatic attitude of Western musicians. Music should be written down with notes to be read, learned and performed from notation, which is the revolutionary pedagogical and theoretical idea of Guido Aretinus from 10th century, and then passed on the next generation. The purpose of a new theory based upon music literacy was to place music education within a pragmatic modern foundation and to reconcile the two domains separated by old theorists, namely the theory from practice. Kandemir is the first theorist of Islamic music to enhance music notation as the core of theoretical approach. End of the quotation. However, his theoretical invention, namely notation, method, and methodology, had not been taken as an autonomous science or scientific experiment, nor it happened with Guido's solmization, nor with any of the theoretical musical systems. The science as positive knowledge is legitimate and exists only under the criterion of objectivity, objectivity for and of any particular phenomenon. Objective knowledge means repeating of the observation in order to guarantee the same results as in the beginning of the experiment. In other words, it is about standardization of the phenomena. Possible only if the phenomenon is not observable as unique, but as something familiar and common. Thus, in the singing, for instance, the science does not see unique human voices or personal voice tradition, but objective pitches or physical vibrations, sections which are inaccessible to the reason unless by normative measuring procedures. To be scientifically correct requires measuring these pitches, defining and fixing them, and afterwards following the results of these operations as a norm of the objective access to the tradition. For the scientific approach, if pitches, intervals, scales, systems, etc., used in two oral or non-oral practices seems to be similar or equal, it means that we have sufficient knowledge about these traditions and have already understood them. Further, because of the structural or other external similarities, one theorist could feel free to assert even the dependence of one of them to the other. The question about the man truth and truthfulness is not in the sphere of scientific methodology, but emerges from its whole existence and experience. Quotation. Hence, the human sciences are connected to modes of experience that lie outside the science. With the experiences of philosophy, of art, and of history itself, these are all modes of experience in which a truth is communicated that cannot be verified by the methodological means proper to science. End of the quotation. It was from Gadamer. Oral tradition and hermeneutics. Second part of my talk. In the Christian ecclesiastical music of the East, known as Psaltic, we see two main characteristics. First, that is an oral tradition as many others, and second, that this tradition is solely vocal as few others. In this use, oral is an opposite of written, and therefore we have oral tradition in teaching also instruments, for instance, gaida. As the other traditions, the Psaltic, being an oral tradition, has the same nature or status towards people who are not involved in it. Namely, it is not a culture in the sense of overall value. Such a tradition is not for anyone who is interesting, like, for instance, football. We cannot have a World Cup competition and World Cup champion in Psaltic or in folk tales and songs. To participate in an oral tradition is not comparable even to playing European classical music or doing scientific research. I'm free to play Mozart or doing chemistry regardless of the place I'm playing or doing it and my religious beliefs. It is not like driving or manufacturing a car. Shortly, it is not applicable for everywhere and usable for anyone. On the contrary, it is always something strange, hermetic, mysterious, and even mystical. The access to the oral tradition is not by logic or objective knowledge, but from inside, by accepting a certain lifestyle in devoting myself to it. The secret of the tradition is something that cannot be disclosed by any distant education, mechanism, or broadly, mathematical procedures. Objective knowledge recognizes structures and similarity, in our case, ecclesiastical tones. And anyone, even that who does not sing or play at all, can learn these structures and can be brilliantly good at them. There is no problem for me to learn any scales and proportions and to find the most proper name and definitions for them. However, on this base, a completely external position, it would never be possible for me to represent the tradition in which I found these scales used, to understand what happened there. Even less, I cannot involve myself in it. It is easy for me to take a scale described in one ancient or medieval treatise and to pretend that I know what the living tradition of those times was. But it remains just a pretension. Being once dead, an oral music tradition could not be restored from a written monument except as a museum exhibit. It is not a live one. Structures and scales are repeatable, and we can easily put them down on a sheet or stone, but without the holder of their living face, they are only dead monuments. The scientific methodology and knowledge, being a result of a distant research position, includes only cases and excludes personal fates. Nevertheless, the tradition continuation is a personal choice and devotion of both living teacher and disciple. Being just scientifically well educated, I have no access to the way of how to sing an ecclesiastical tone or mode. It requires at least that I have had a personal ear experience from it and have been often taking part of repeating it under the supervision of teacher of authority. The more I participate in the tradition, the more its secrets are getting closer and clear for me. In front of an oral tradition, I'm in a hermeneutic milieu like nowhere else. Here, the assessment of my place in it is coming only from inside of my personal relationships with the teacher and my participation in his way of making it, and not from rationally understanding of it. Thus, the true existing of one vocal or oral tradition depends on the live interpretation, which as a theoretical issue is part of the realm of philosophy and particularly of hermeneutics. From the work of great thinkers like Heidegger, Ortega y Gasset, Gabriel Marcel, Gadamer, we already know that even the smallest objectivity or factus in our life is a result of our interpretation. It means that I'm always in a hermeneutic situation and nothing in my life is a simple everyday occurrence. Respectively, the only one fact is that I am essentially alone with my situation. The succession of that is, it is only me who is changeable because the being which is able to have a world is me. In my treatment towards the phenomena which I meet, I am that who has to decide about them, to compose them as a world. Furthermore, in this general field, music philosophy adds the theme of the unique place of the music as regards to the hermeneutic situation at least. The traditional folk songs could be a proper example for clarifying the place of Psaltic in the universal music hermeneutics. A quotation. The world-famous pianist, composer, and collector of original folk melodies, Percy Grainger, says, "Undoubtedly, the world's most lovely melodies are found in folk songs. This is quite natural. Folk songs are, in almost all cases, melodies without accompaniment of any kind, and the folk singer, singing entirely alone, is able to concentrate all his creative powers upon expression in a single line, by which I mean the curves and contrasts of sound given out by a single voice or instrument." End of the quotation. In other words, the first and the fundamental criterion of the oral music tradition is the human voice. Any other non-vocal, or better non-voiced criterion would be essentially external and thus inconvenient or sort of a compromise. Being one accepted, the external criterion can be rejected at any time if it does not respond to the tradition and represent it. For the oral song tradition, the arguments of the epistemology are initially not applied, because the judgments and the decisions of what must happen and what is correct in it are always in the hands of the personal voice of its holder. The justification of the true beliefs belongs not to any precise scientific method, but to the unique experience and choice of one person. It is not a democracy. They belong to the magister, to the masters, and have nothing to do with means that are not his voice, it is, that are whatever instrumentum. The phrase, "This is the way my teacher was singing the song," ούτως το έλεγε ο δάσκαλός μου, is not only a common rule, but also the principle which builds up and guarantees the proper existence of the Psaltic. But Percy Granger's words show that the same principle founds any oral folk tradition, regardless of whether it is written or not. In fact, only because of the determinative observance of this principle, any oral tradition musicology is possible. Hermeneutic dignity of pneumatic notation. The place of the Psaltic is between the scientifically elaborated music, the art music, and the entirely liberal singing. Quotation again from Percy Granger. Art music, being created solely or mainly by a single composer, develops great individuality in him, but suppresses individuality in the performer. Folk music, on the other hand, encourages almost unlimited individuality in the performer, to such an extent that it is hard to say with such music where the creative and executive roles begin and end. End of the quotation. Being put in pneumatic notation, the melodies of Orthodox singing are not compositions. It must be remained that before the 20th century, the 20th years of 19th century, the notation was not punctual and the student could not follow, respectively observe, patterns and melodies note by note. The books with this notation are not partiture di voce, scores, but rather handbooks, assistants for recalling experience, which includes not merely already imprinted in memory melodies and patterns, but most of all the way of interpreting them. This logic continued until our days, regardless of the reform of the notation in the 821. Namely, the notes are in use mainly for justifying and explaining.
You have 2 minutes.
Sorry?
2 minutes.
Yeah. Namely, the notes are in use mainly for justifying and explain, if possible, experience and authority of one or another magister or protopsaltis. But notation does not mean that the successors of these masters and correspondingly the successors of these successors are obliged to observe the notes of their masters. That is, the real vocal pieces could easily exist under a concrete name or as anonym, because as individuality and singularity the author reals does not matter. The modern history, the pieces exist as a different kind of musical form of a given tone and of a given type of these notes. The modern history of printed Psaltic books in Greek is full with illustrative examples of this principle. Plenty of different versions of a given song or type of tone, all pretending to represent the tradition. However, exactly on this scientifically not approvable principle, the oral tradition of Psaltic could be ensured in a highest degree, keeping the openness of the pneumatic notation as methodological law will guarantee the real existence of the personal voice and ear abilities. The strength and the dignity of the pneumatic notation come from the possibilities which it opens to masters and teachers. being hermeneutic, it does not take away the personal freedom and authority. The perspective of musical thinking remains reverse, and thus the whole treasure of non-written levels remain preserved. I'm finishing here.
Okay.
It ensures also approach to the natural musical phenomenon by not demanding fixed way of seeing and hearing the notes. The interpretation continued to depend on the person as devoted and not necessarily with a specific gift. Shortly to speak, the pneumatic notation is the best theoretical solution for the purposes it chases after, and one of the most beautiful systems of denoting I have ever worked with. Thank you very much.